Okay, so we are live. The event is being live streamed to our London Vegans Facebook group. Welcome everybody. My name is Brian Jacobs. I'm the organizer for London Vegans meetings, and we have a meeting generally on the last Wednesday of every month with a guest speaker, and sometimes we have a discussion evening as well. Especially welcome to anybody who's new to our group. I'm pleased to announce that for tonight's guest speaker, we have James O'Donovan. And James is from Vegan Sustainability magazine with a presentation titled Fossil Fuels or Foods, I think it is, Carbon Opportunity Costs and Future Prospects. And talking about why a vegan transition is the most important ecological choice we can make for the planet. I'll hand over to James. I could say if anybody has any questions, if you could hold them towards the end, you can send a message through the chat to me and we'll ask the questions, and then I'll open it up for people to make announcements, questions at the end of this session. So without further ado, I hand over to James. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks a million. And thanks for the invitation to come along and speak this evening. I'm in Cork in Ireland, and I'm going to do a presentation with quite a bit of slides and information, and then some time to talk about what are some of the strategies that we can use to bring about a plant-based food system. So I'll just start this. So Vegan Sustainability magazine, we're based in Ireland. Myself and Bronwyn Slater are the co-editors. We started this a few years ago. And we're also happy to have writers like Paul Appleby, who I see is along this evening, writing articles for us. And today's talk, we'll talk about some of the impacts of fossil foods. I'm going to use this term fossil foods just to talk about, meat, dairy, fish, just as an overarching term. Maybe it's not a perfect term, but the impacts of fossil foods on nature and food security, and some of the potential benefits of a plant-based food system and prospects for change in Europe. The context, the region, I suppose I'm talking about is the European region and changes there. So I find it helpful to use this model to think about change. Obviously we see events happening, whether it's the floods in Pakistan or, changing weather patterns around us that are very visible these days. And so we can understand the patterns, the cause and effect relationships driving those events, and then why things are happening. Often with human systems, they're supported by systemic structures. So obviously lots of people now are talking about system change. So when we talk about future prospects, we'll talk about that a little bit. So the subsidies underpinning, fossil foods, meat and dairy and fish. And obviously beneath those systemic structures, people have belief systems, models. So that's something that education can touch on as people try to learn about, the truth about, the fossil foods, how they're prepared, the fishing industry and so on, and their harmful aspects on other sentient beings. So this is a model that's used increasingly these days to try and get a sense of the complexity of environmental systems, which are the living systems that we are dependent on. So it looks at 9 planetary boundaries, and they estimate where we are with respect to those planetary boundaries. Some of them have not yet been quantified, like Biodiversity Integrity Index, but Europe, the UK and Ireland are in the red zone for that already. This is extinctions, thousands of extinctions per million species per year. Then you've got fresh water, you've got climate change, novel entities or new chemicals that we're putting into the environment, and that includes, for example, pesticides. Land systems change is the conversion of natural ecosystems to human-based ecosystems. And down the bottom then we've got nutrient flows, phosphorus and nitrogen flows. So now human systems from fertilizers are about 3 times what would be the natural background flows of phosphorus and nitrogen. So we'll just look at a few of these planetary boundaries in a simple way this evening. We'll start with land use. I suppose one of the key things we can start to think about is that land ecosystems, they're like the housing and the supermarkets, and also security, safety for all other species. So as soon as an ecosystem is altered, then you get biodiversity loss. So when ecosystems are impacted by agriculture, which is the main driver of habitat loss and degradation, the other main one being deforestation, then you get biodiversity loss. And a vegan food system from research can reduce that land use by 3/4. So this is an image from the IPCC, and it shows the 130 million square kilometers of ice-free land and how massively humans are impacting it. So all the built-up areas on the planet just make up 1%, but all the crops and all the pastures make up over half of the land on the planet, and all of that land is in the most productive areas. There's just a few regions like the Amazon rainforest, the Congo rainforest. An awful lot of the rainforest in Southeast Asia has already been converted for agriculture. And then then you have deforestation. So you've got plantation forests and then managed forests. So humans are impacting, most of the planet now, with only about 1/4 of the planet relatively free of human impact. And beef and lamb, for example, they're a huge, beef is a huge quantity of produced fossil foods, and beef and lamb use over 50 times the land area of protein-rich crops like peas. So obviously, anytime you choose meat, dairy, then you need much more land, and so you have a much bigger impact on biodiversity. So this is from the WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and it shows the main impacts on biodiversity loss. So you can see the keys down in the bottom left. So habitat degradation or habitat loss is red, and then exploitation, fishing, hunting, trade in wildlife is in orange. And so 60 to 85% of the biodiversity loss for birds, mammals, fishes, reptiles, and amphibians comes from habitat loss and exploitation. So invasive species, pollution, and climate change only make up less than 20 to 30%. So land use, and for example, in tropical areas, agriculture is 80% of the deforestation. In the northern forests, like in northern Canada and Russia, it's mostly for timber. So agriculture and fishing are the main drivers of biodiversity loss on the planet. This is an image from Argentina, showing conversion of ecosystems for soy cultivation for animal feed. 96% of the soy, or 94% of the soy that's grown goes to animal feed. Basically all the soy in South America is genetically modified soy. So in Europe, fortunately, that doesn't enter the food system for direct human consumption, but it is imported for animal feed. So it is going for chickens, poultry, and cattle feed, and fish farming. So this shows a conversion, from a native Irish grassland to just a monoculture. So all those flowers on the left-hand side, they're all providing, pollen and nectar for insects, supporting birds and other wildlife. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have this radical simplification of the ecosystem, just monocultures, and again, that leading to insect decline, and also it's affecting the soil ecosystems as well. So this image appeared in The Guardian some years ago, that 96% of large mammals now are farmed animals and humans, with only 4% of the biomass of large mammals being in the wild. So again, just to reiterate, grazing, animal agriculture is 82% of our farmland. Grazing, which is a huge proportion of the farmland, produces just about 2% of our food calories. And animal agriculture produces 18% of our calories. So on the other hand, 82% of all the food calories consumed today are plant-based. So now we just need to increase that and get it to 100. So agricultural land is now the largest ecosystem on the planet. And if you just go to Google Maps and go down to 5-kilometer resolution and then move that in different countries, you get this typical pattern. Now in Ireland, this is an Irish image. It's grass-fed based. In other countries, it'll be different. Sometimes this is intensive pasture. So all these fields, every 5 years, they're sprayed with Roundup and cleared, and then they're reseeded just to get to maximize the output. But they're still incredibly inefficient systems. And so now, this is from our World in Data. It's a really good source of information, and it shows that as we transition to a vegan diet, we would reduce the amount of land we use for agriculture by 75%. So that's a massive, huge benefit for restoring our ecosystems. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, also, it would have significant benefits for reversing climate change. So just to highlight that point again, it comes from this paper, which some of you, I'm sure, will know, Poor and Nemchek, fantastic paper. Without meat and dairy consumption, global farmland use can be reduced by a huge level, and still we'd be more food secure than we are now. So the second boundary then is climate change. So on the current published research, fossil foods globally produce 20% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, and in Europe, it's 25%. So this research comes from the European Joint Research Commission. It shows that overall the food system is responsible for 34% of global emissions, and the food system is responsible for 30% of EU emissions. Okay, now that includes all stages. It includes agriculture, it includes transport, refrigeration, packaging, and waste, 34%. So the 20% figure is just the fossil foods, so globally, emissions from animal ag are 20%. Now there's lots of, scientists saying that that's more, but this is kind of the general accepted position right now. And then over 80% of EU food emissions come from meat, dairy, and eggs. So that's how come you get the 25% of EU food system emissions coming from fossil foods. So in environmental groups, there was an awful lot of talk about food miles and local food systems. That still goes on today. You know, from a climate perspective, it's what you eat matters, not if your food is local. So you can see there, land use change, on-farm emissions, animal feed, processing, transport, retail, packaging, and food losses or food waste at the end. So you can see that land use change and farm emissions dominate for most foods, you know, so then moving towards a plant-based system obviously has the biggest impact. So methane is another leading gas, as well as nitrous oxide. The majority of methane emissions in the EU come from fossil foods, and reducing methane emissions is the fastest way to address climate change because they're such a powerful warming gas. But still, the agricultural policy in Europe is not addressing that so far. And also, fertilizers contributes to climate change, and 80% of all nitrogen inputs in Europe goes for animal feed use. So the European agricultural system, the UK agricultural system, is dominated by, you know, pasture and then feed crops for animals, as well as importing feed crops from other countries. If you look at dairy and plant milks, you can also just compare land use, greenhouse gas emissions, freshwater use, and eutrophication is the nitrates and phosphates. So for those four indicators, then dairy milk is substantially the worst, you know. So from an environmental perspective, there's a lot of reasons to move towards a plant-based food system. Now, one concept that isn't talked about in climate change so much is the carbon opportunity cost. And what that talks about is that whenever you make a decision, then, for example, by us choosing in Ireland to have grass-fed beef or ecosystem-fed beef, then we're eliminating the possibility of having forests on that land. So then there's a opportunity cost from that decision, which should be taken into consideration when we're presenting the information around deciding which food systems to pick. So recent research has shown that a vegan food system and allowing land to recover its original vegetation could sequester 15 years of our current emissions. And soils, there was more uncertainty around the soils, but they would add an additional 7.5 years, which is over 20 years of emissions sequestered. And there is nothing close, absolutely, that would even come close to achieving that. Now, this paper, just to highlight this, the name of the paper is Unexpectedly Large Impact of Forest Management and Grazing on Global Vegetation Biomass. And it estimated the cumulative emissions from deforestation and grazing at 1,710 billion tons of CO2. And that's going all the way back to prehistoric times, because Europe's forests were already, many of them were cleared millennia ago, you know, with early agriculture. But lots of that carbon dioxide that was released with the clearance of those forests still remains in the atmosphere, but it's not counted in the current models. So they estimate that 1,700 billion tons of CO2 comes from land use changes, primarily, again, the paper says, driven by agriculture. And cumulative emissions from fossil fuels since 1750 is 1,740 billion tons. So all of the information around climate change is about, annual emissions. So, but that explains why, if we could free up the land and allow the vegetation to be restored in these ecosystems, it would have a huge impact. So this shows that business as usual, we'll see increased emissions from agriculture. If we were to adopt the Eat Lancet diet, so for Europeans, that means an 80% reduction, more or less, in meat consumption. And a vegan diet is achieving very large reductions, basically, in sequestering carbon into vegetation. So just to show the budget that we have, if we're to have any chance of staying within 1.5 degrees, is 440 gigatons. So this transition really is a huge contribution. Now we need to transition off fossil fuels, but the other thing that this study highlights is that biomass solutions carry huge risks, because there's much more benefit in restoring those ecosystems and huge benefits for biodiversity. And we can do that with a plant-based food system. So the IPBES is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So they're the biodiversity equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their big report came out in 2019, highlighting, land use change and agriculture and forestry drive that, and fisheries being the biggest impact of biodiversity on the planet. So I wanted to talk briefly just about the oceans. So under the oceans, you have, on the left-hand side, we're all familiar with coral reefs, but you have huge biogenic ecosystems in the ocean made by living organisms. So these can be, obviously, we know of the famous kelp forests. We've got seagrass meadows. We've also got, huge areas covered by mussels or oysters, and they provide precious niches for biodiversity. So bottom trawling, that's probably the most destructive form of fisheries, where the bottom seabed is plowed, and basically, it kind of dumps 19 kilograms for every 1 kilogram of marine organisms that are taken. And it also has huge emissions, and those emissions, same as the global aviation sector annually, according to that paper by Enric Sala, and that's not included in the current IPCC accounting methods. So the global seabird population have declined by 70% from 1950 to 2010, and they're a proxy also for the health of the oceans and the fisheries. So and their population, and that's driven again by the fishing industry. So this was the intensity of ocean fishing back in 1950, and this is the intensity of the ocean fisheries today. Fish provides less than 2% of global calories. Obviously, in some communities, for example, in West Africa, some communities are dependent in terms of subsistence and survival on their fisheries. And now some of those communities now, you have long distance fishery fleets, in particular from China, Taiwan, fishing off the coast of West Africa and putting in fish meal and fish oil plants for aquaculture, for farmed fish, factory farmed fish. So you also, you've got lots of things in the fishing sector. You've got, even in the UK and Ireland, they've been articles in the media on human trafficking for fishing fleets in Europe. It sounds unbelievable, but that if you just do a search on that, you can see some reports on that. So there's lots of different issues. You've got bycatch, of course, and then you've got illegal, unregistered or unregulated fishing boats, which are huge boats, you know, operating as well, and their catch is not even counted. So now food security. So the human edible food calories fed to farmed animals would be enough to feed a lot more people. So there's no food shortage. So we'll spend a little bit of time just on this diagram here. So you can see over on the left-hand side, that's how much calories are grown. Nearly 6,000 calories per person per day are grown. And then there is some losses from harvest, during harvest, post-harvest losses. And then you end up with, here, you have 1,738 edible human suitable crops that are fed to farmed animals. So that's obviously it's maize and soybeans, but it's also most of the wheat grown in Ireland, nearly all of the barley grown in Ireland, most of the oats grown in Ireland and across Europe are fed to farmed animals. And also grass, pasture and stover, that's also fed to animals. And all of that means that ecosystems are impacted, and all of that nutrients is taken from wildlife, and that's why you see you know, the biodiversity crashing. But it's massively inefficient. So all of those calories only produce 594 kilocalories per person per day of meat, fish and dairy, and all the rest of it is converted to waste, to slurry that gets disposed on lands, goes into rivers and causes the dead zones. So you can see there isn't a shortage of food. Just to highlight, fuel currently consumes 808 calories per person per day. And again, you know, that's much more, you know, there isn't enough biomass, you know, to provide the energy that the kind of lifestyles that we lead in Europe and other countries need, you know. So whenever you hear people proposing converting biomass for energy, you know, you should, in my opinion, it's usually not a good idea. So just to summarize that, so the world's croplands could feed 4 billion more people than they do now, just from shifting from producing animal feed to biofuels. So that was another research paper, different to the previous one that I showed. That's from the University of Minnesota back in 2013. And it's because this food conversion ratio, this just highlights you need 25 kilograms of feed to get 1 kg of beef out. Now, the food conversion ratio varies from what I can see from paper to paper. I just took this one from our World in Data. So that's the main thing I'm trying to get across with this slide. And I'll make the slides available. I realize I'm working through them briskly, but just to get the idea across. So they were the key insights that I touched on. So massive benefits from a vegan food system to reduce land use. Meat, dairy and eggs produce 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial fishing, you know, hugely damaging on marine ecosystems and marine wildlife. Tiny contribution. This 2 kilocal per person also includes all the farmed fish. Tiny contribution to food security. Now, in those communities that are doing artisanal fishing, they're going to continue. They don't have any choices, but industrialized countries do have choices. Food security, there's plenty of food. Ireland and the EU are net food calorie importers. We're economically, because we import cheap human edible food crops and we export more expensive animal products. And a vegan food system could store 21, I think it was 22 of current global emissions across the next 30 years. So these are big changes if they could come about. Now, future prospects. So systemic structures like subsidies lock in unsustainable food systems. So one of the key issues are, how do we shift the subsidies so that they support more plant-based foods, basically, that are good for the environment. In Europe, they're spending 380 billion over 7 years. 30% of the budget goes to 6% of the farmers. And the vast majority of that goes to it's based on land areas. So the biggest, richest farmers get the most money. So how to change that system? In the last public consultation, there was, tens of thousands of people calling for change, and still European politicians resisted most of that, really, and kept it the same. What does it look like? In Ireland, dairy farmers are highly profitable in Ireland at the moment. So this is the value of DPs, or direct payments. So the average dairy farmer gets a check in the door worth 21,000 euros. And the average beef farmer gets a check of about 15,000, and so on, tillage 27. And this is the percentage it makes up of their farmed income. So for beef and sheep, for beef cattle rearing systems, the farmer operates at a loss, so that shows that for these systems, which are massive economically unviable without the subsidies, there is potential to change those, and they occupy 70%. Obviously, dairy farmers, you can see their income in Ireland, the average, this is for 2021, the average income is nearly 100,000. So why are we spending 360? Why are we giving dairy farmers 360 million a year? For beef farmers, their incomes are very low. So if they stopped beef farming and allowed their farms to go back to forestry, their incomes could increase. But from politicians in Ireland and from farmers groups, any change really is fought tooth and nail, and they're successfully lobbying in order to keep these systems in place. So also for global fisheries, there's a lot of work done now exploring, the subsidies and how they continue. So if they could be changed, but it's very hard to change that. In each year, they keep the system going. So they're another factor keeping the status quo going. Now, there is some scientific agreement on the need to change protein production systems and overall to change the food system. The Eat Lancet report, I think many of you, if you're interested in the research papers, will have seen that in 2019. It's not a vegan plate, but for Europeans and North Americans, it would mean an 80% reduction in meat consumption. And the Eat Lancet report allows for a fully vegan plate. So, but it's saying that everybody should be consuming, plant-based proteins. And then it's saying that the animal proteins are optional. So Project Drawdown has, a transition towards a plant-based food system as one of its key goals, and as ecosystem restoration as another key goal. And so they're a leading mainstream climate website and also organization. And then the University of Leeds have a Take the Jump campaign, and they're calling for a plant-based food system in their Take the Jump campaign, as well as reducing food waste, as well as other changes in other areas of people's lives. So there's already a lot of good research and information out there, but change obviously is challenging. So as yet, a lot of people think of other species, other individuals, other sentient beings as resources. So can we widen our circle of compassion to include other species? This is the Go Vegan World campaign. So that's run by Sandra Higgins, who is based here in Ireland. It's also, she's run many of these campaigns in the UK, and it's a really successful campaign. And it also explores, about the belief systems that people have around animal products, that cultural conditioning that makes it seem normal to consume animal products. So the UN, of course, they come up with lots of, declarations and policy documents, but without, actual steps to change the food system, mostly they haven't been successful in bringing about change. You can say that. This is an initiative in Ireland, in County Meath. Lots of people will have been highlighting the project, Isabella Trees project down there to the west of London. Now they are producing fossil foods. This fella who runs this estate, he's vegan, and he's getting zero subsidies in order to do this work. So if we could stop subsidizing fossil foods and move the subsidies for nature and biodiversity, that's a key thing that could happen. So no take marine protected areas. I'd recommend, Sylvia Earle is calling for people to stop eating fish as sentient beings. Enric Sala with National Geographic isn't, but he's still calling for massive marine protected areas. And he has 2 TED Talks online, which I'd highly recommend. And Sylvia Earle, any of her talks or her interview with Rich Roll on that podcast, really fantastic. Now in the UK, the WWF produced the Value of Restored Seas report, and it just shows how damaging fishing industry is and how huge the economic benefits could be. Now they're not calling for an end of fishing, but the other benefits dwarf the economic returns to the fishing industry. So if you just phased out the fishing industry, there wouldn't be any, there wouldn't be significant economic problems compared to the other benefits. But still, there is a little bit of a dip in global production, but the predictions are that meat consumption and production is going to grow. So poultry, pig meat, and beef are the 3 main ones. So this is meat supply per person from up to 2019. So these, Ireland, the EU, and the UK, Ireland decreased a little bit, not major change, huge change in some Asian countries with huge populations. And, lots of research shows that as countries get more wealthy, meat consumption goes up because of this belief associating it wealth, status, and meat consumption. But that, fortunately, is changing. So just thinking about all the stakeholders involved supporting the food system, there are many. They're full of, highly educated people, and all of them, some of them are very supportive of fossil foods. Some don't care as long as they make profit. and others are supportive of a vegan food system, a plant-based food system. But there's a lot of people, but it does mean that you can target different groups in campaigning. So there's a whole range of different strategies that people can use, from protein tech development, obviously George Monbiot, he's been talking a lot about precision fermentation. They're high energy use foods like beans and legumes and plant-based proteins seem much more sensible to me. But I do think that perhaps the precision fermentation dairy, the whey protein, coming from companies like Perfect Day, which it's now being sold in the US, has the potential to disrupt the dairy industry. There are many other perspectives you could come from: workers' rights, food security, antimicrobial resistance. Each of these areas has groups campaigning for them. So if they could somehow link up, somehow it could increase the impact and the speed of the transition. At the same time, you've got huge investment, so you can't see the one at the top there, but it's talking about 2.6 billion pumped into meat and dairy industries. The EU spending hundreds of millions advertising meat and dairy, and then in Ireland you've got overseas investment coming in for processing plants. You do have campaign groups working to try and address the cap in Europe, and then you've got legal challenges like the European Court of Justice ruling in the Netherlands, and then Antashka is the Irish equivalent of the National Trust, taking the state to court over its nitrates failure to reduce nitrates in water bodies in Ireland, rivers and lakes. So there's the Danish government. Let's see, did I miss one? No. Danish government invests 100 million in plant-based funds, and the EU also investing in all proteins. So now there's large conferences happening in Europe with hundreds of researchers in universities around the place working to develop these alt proteins. And then you've got campaigns, like UK students calling for plant-based meals. So that's also, younger people are, much more likely to be more informed and educated around these issues. So that's it, I think. There are just a few final thoughts. Yeah, price parity. Yeah, so, and also learning from other, social justice, social liberation movements, and trying to build coalitions, having a broad diversity of people, so it'll take many things to change. I'll end with this slide. The mental models are key, stories that connect vegan foods with health, wealth, intelligence, non-violence, compassion, kindness. And really, fossil foods are associated with poor health, with violence, poverty, I'm not so sure, so changing the story is going to be key. Okay, so there are a few thoughts for you.
Thank you
and
very
so if
much.
anybody has any questions, yeah, I'm happy.
Thank you very much. Just let me pin myself on here. Okay. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, if they could raise their hand, please, so that we could see. I'm just going to pull up the chat section as well. No, there's just a comment by Paul. It said Lord Dunsany, who is vegan and I understand of Dunsany Castle, gave a Zoom talk to Sentient Rights Island.
And he had to leave, but
yeah, he had to leave.
Yeah. So he's a great communicator, Lord Dunsany. He's been on lots of media.
Yeah.
And now Trinity College Dublin is also doing research into how the ecosystems are recovering. But again, he's getting zero funding from the government for doing that work.
Yeah. John? Let me just see if I can unmute you.
Got it.
Okay.
Yes, a fascinating talk, pretty unique, very scientific. Liked it very much. Something which you could add, although you may want to think about it first, but I don't know if you've heard. I was going to mention this in the people making points afterwards. Have you heard of the doomsday clock? The doomsday clock was set up by nuclear scientists after the Second World War, with a clock as a countdown of possible end of life as we know it. Initially, they just sit on nuclear, at the risk of a nuclear war. And they introduced other things, which included climate change, which is very pertinent to this. And they've just added a new one as well, zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases transfers from animals to humans. And it's increasing because we're living in closer proximity to wild animals because of we're expanding and they got less room. We come into contact with them more. And also the intensive factory farming is producing lots of animals in a close space, routinely given antibiotics, and new diseases coming along. So I think, and these guys who do it are probably arguably the best brains and the best educated people in the world who produce a doomsday clock. It's worth having a little slide on them regarding climate change and zoonotic disease.
Yeah, zoonotic disease is another key one, antimicrobial resistance is another huge one.
It was very similar, yes.
Yeah.
So you could tie the two in.
Absolutely,
somehow, yes.
Yeah. It's I heard somebody saying one time, when you kind of look into something, and you do a bit more research, you're always kind of expecting to think maybe that wasn't such a good idea in the past. But when you look at vegan systems, you keep doing more research and you keep finding more reasons that affirm it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Good
Thanks.
point. Let me just remove the spotlight on them. Any other questions for James while people are considering? As Tina says, I wonder if James has any thoughts on Ecotricity's plans to generate green gas. I don't know whether Ecotricity is in Ireland. They're a vegan electricity company, energy company in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. So there's, the Irish government have a policy now to generate green gas from ecosystems, using anaerobic digestion.
Yeah.
And so in other countries, anaerobic digesters were more small scale, and they were used, to anaerobically digest animal waste to produce methane, which was burned for cooking. Now they're being scaled up. And so in Ireland, about 60% of the feedstock is going to come from grass or crops, and 40% of the feedstock is going to come from slurry from animal waste. So it's problematic twofold. It will only end up producing, they're planning 130 to 150 plants, 1.5 billion investment. It'll only contribute it'll displace 20% of our current so-called fossil gas use, but that's, again, just a third of our total energy use. If you were to use, so one problem is when you build that, then those feedstocks are locked in. So you lock in animal agriculture. And so, so that's detrimental. But also, if you converted that to forests, you'd have much more beneficial sequestration of greenhouse gases that are much better. So what I would suggest for you, there's a report from a group called Feedback, and it's called Green Gas Without the Hot Air. And it's specifically looking at the UK. Green Gas Without the Hot Air from Feedback. And it shows you exactly, the pros and cons of it in detail. So the only reason I know about it really is because I'm kind of doing an article on that report for our next issue. So I've just been reading up on a bit about it recently. So when you hear about it, it sounds good, you know, but myself personally, I don't think it's a good option. They say in Ireland it's going to displace 400,000 cattle, you know, but are the, you know, farmers in Ireland, they're not inclined to get rid of their cattle. So are they going to just bring in feed from other places? It's quite likely. And then, you know, again, it's that issue of using biomass. It's much better, in my view, from what I understand, to transition to wind and solar. Yeah. And, you know, even if you do have backup fossil gases, you know, I think that's going to be there for some time.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you for the question also. Paul, let me...
Hello.
Hi, Paul.
Yes,
I've never actually
James,
seen you in person.
we meet at last, yes.
We do, yeah. Nice to see you.
Communicated exclusively by email.
Yeah.
James, I'm sure you meet this objection. I mean, Ireland is very much is a sparsely populated country, certainly compared to the UK or most of the UK, and very agricultural and probably sort of dominated by agriculture. How would you counter the objection that this is all we can grow, as it were, in an island's farmland is animal protein, whether it's milk, meat, and it's just not suitable for growing, or much of the land maybe not so suitable for growing arable crops.
Like, you know, like we know lots of these things, cultural shifts are difficult, isn't it? And how we're conditioned, the beliefs that we have around many of these issues, you know, they don't stand up in actuality. So Ireland, you know, also lots of countries, they have impacts, historical impacts, because whenever you're talking about land use, history matters a lot. So Ireland was colonized. So now we just have 1% native forest and we just have 11% forest cover. Whereas now that's not too different from the UK, but the European average is closer to nearly 38% or so. But Ireland in the 1920s distributed land and people were extremely poor and it was survival, subsistence farming. So at that time, there was about nearly the exact same amount of land, 4.5 million hectares farmed. But there was about 4.5 million households, you know, farming. Now, farmers only make up about 5% of the population. And so the average farm size is about 35 hectares. It's the systems in the west of Ireland where you have, you know, poor quality soil, more inclement weather, you know, the quantity of food that they produce per hectare is tiny. You know, so those if the subsidies weren't there, they're not economically viable. They would have disappeared a long time ago without the subsidies. The only thing that keeps them there is the subsidies. Now, there are large parts of the east and the south of Ireland that are perfectly fine for tillage. Ireland imports about 3.5 million tons of crops for food, for animal feed, you know, so it's easy for Ireland to feed itself with protein, you know, from agricultural land. And we would also, in a similar way as the model we talked about, we could see a huge reduction in our agricultural land use. Of course, that's going to be fought, you know, but if those farmers can be paid for ecosystem services using the current budgets, those farmers in the west of Ireland, their budgets would increase. Then other things I think are going to disrupt dairy, like, you know, perhaps these precision fermentation dairy products. If they reach, you know, price parity, taste, they should be taste because they're the same product, you know, and availability, that's going to be a serious problem for the dairy farmers, because the you know, the supermarkets and the food processors, they'll be able to increase their margins by using these products potentially. So that argument, you know, is there, but you know, like farmers and politicians, they're going to fight, you know, they're not going to go along with these changes. A politician recently caused any suggestions for change, for reduction to beef production. He compared it to ethnic cleansing on the mainstream media. So you have really people using, you know, inflated stories, but still, you know, when people are persisting with the truth of plant-based, it's getting in there, you know, the non-violence, you know, the healthy, you know, they're affordable, they're, you know, all those things they get in. Okay. So change is not going to be easy, Paul, you know, I think, as everybody knows, but I think it can come still.
Okay, thank you. Great question and great answer again. I've got Ahmed. If you could just, before you say anything, Ahmed, could you just tell me if you're okay to be on the video?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna just find you on the system. Okay, there we are. Far ahead.
Hey everyone, thanks James, really interesting talk, lots of data I didn't know about. Just to, can I make a point and then ask a question? So the one point is that I was recently, because of a project I'm working on, which I'd like to tell you about subsequently, I was visiting a farm recently that had 4 massive anaerobic digestion units on it to provide the electricity for an 11-acre greenhouse full of cherry tomatoes. What I found interesting was I think 2/3 of the content that went in was maize that they grew on site. So huge amounts of maize just to feed the AD units. It kind of made me scratch my head a bit. Yeah. Maybe the economics work, but just seems to be a bit. I mean, obviously it's not scraps, it's not waste. It's stuff grown for that purpose, which seems a bit strange.
What I saw is that 60% of the feedstock on the big ones is food grown for it, dumped.
Yeah. So that would coincide. Yeah. My question is this about the you know, having looked at for a project which I won't go into details now because it's, you know, not appropriate, around driving transitions. It seems to be the kind of, let's say, the control around grazing, which is the macro problem. And if we could unlock that, then that's the key thing, you know, because the retort you get is they can't use the land for anything else. If you don't put animals on it, you have to spend money cutting the grass or whatever, and things like that. You know, the farmers don't tend to be interested in the idea that actually their grazing land used to be forest, and so trees could grow on it. You know, and so on. What's your view about how to unlock the change of graze? I mean, most of the land is grazing, isn't it? And
oh yeah,
the thing.
Yeah, like in Ireland, like 92% of our ag land is grazing, believe it or not, and 8% is tillage, including a tiny bit for horticulture. And of that 8%, you know, 80% of that goes for feed. You know, but farmers that I've met, you know, they even sometimes they don't like trees. Sometimes farmers, you know, they have like they see trees as sometimes, you know, in really not positive ways. So like in Ireland, you know, we're not familiar with pristine ecosystems, you know. So it's difficult for us, like if you travel, like in Europe, it's difficult to find pristine ecosystems. But when you're in a pristine ecosystem, it really feels different, you know. So how to transition? Like I do think, you know, we need to, they've done brilliantly, you know, like in Ireland, we have a group called Board Bia. There is a government body that do food marketing. we have Chagas, which are a farmer education service, and the universities, and then we have marketing. And all of them tell the story of grass-fed beef, that it's a healthy product and all of that. So we have to do the same with vegan products. We can, undermine the story of grass-fed beef and call it biodiversity-fed beef, ecosystem-fed beef, which is more accurate. And then we can, continue to do the same skillful marketing that they do with our plant-based products. So like people who do very good marketing and who create stories, like they have an Origin Green certification here, which promotes Irish farming as sustainable. Now, Irish farming are in breach of the Water Framework Directive, the Birds Directive, the Habitats Directive, and climate emission goals. But still, they just tell a story of marketing that this is good. Now, with vegan foods, they actually are good. So we have truth on our side. And that's a very powerful thing in the long term. Sometimes people feel frustrated that change isn't happening. But this change, it's going to be good for farmers. We depend on farmers, but it's going to be great for biodiversity if it happens, and we can get the land back for nature, and we don't get caught up with these false solutions, biomass solutions. So the truth of the vegan argument is powerful. Now, who's going to own these vegan foods in the future? That's another argument, but we'll see how it goes.
Oh. To answer the question, Omid?
So I think you talked around it, James, but I think the specific thing about, as I say, I'm working on a project which I'd be great to, if we could talk separately, James. I'd love to get to you to do with private farm transition using certain techniques, let's say.
Yeah, like I'm not an expert on farmers' perspectives, just from what little interaction I can get. But so I don't know, is it true to say if farmers get paid for the trees more than what they'd get now, they'd be willing to go?
Okay, let me digress a little bit. So what it comes down to is what we're trying to do is correlate shift towards more environmentally positive farming with increasing profits.
Yeah.
And proving that case would allow us to then raise money from institutional funds who need environmental impact tick box, and then provide that capital to fund transition projects which are environmentally positive. I've learned not to, I'm a vegan activist, but I've learned not to use the word vegan or plant-based in my conversations. But of course, the biggest lever to achieve environmental positivity in farming is to remove animals. More than anything else.
I have a project that's happening in the west of Ireland now. There's a guy and he's talking to farmers, and he's got European funding now. And what the farmers are doing is they're restoring trees along the rivers and along the boundaries of their farms, strengthening the hedgerows and strengthening the rivers. And tens of thousands of trees are being planted, and they're getting direct funding for it. Now, he's not vegan or anything like that, but the biodiversity in that area is being improved. So small steps, we have to take small steps. And like you say, in communication, depending on who you're talking to, if I met an Irish politician and told him I want to talk about a vegan food system, they wouldn't even answer the phone, they would just shut the door. So you have to be smart in communication.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me move spotlight. Do you need to go, or are you able to take
No, I'm all right. If people have any comments or thoughts, also
just coming up on the system, it says, do you have any tactics or go-to sources for tackling misinformation on the internet?
Misinformation is, difficult. If we remember, like smoking, we know in the US there was this Surgeon General's report that came out You know, I don't know if any of you, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with nutritionfacts.org.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got about 15 different talks on misinformation in nutritional studies. But the big cigarette companies, they just went to a marketing company after that Surgeon General's report came out, you know, black and white people are dying from your products, and they just went about to create doubt, just like the oil companies have created doubt around, you know, fossil fuels and climate change. So that's a strategy, and it works. So they of course have huge resources, so it's very difficult to combat it. So finding trusted, reliable sources of information. Now, the good thing is that there's a lot of peer-reviewed evidence, ecological evidence, that's very obvious in terms of the benefits of a plant-based food system, and also its huge benefits for climate change. You know, just communication, skillful communication. Sometimes, you know, you can complain to your advertising authority or your broadcasting authority. Recently on a radio program in Ireland here, they had a US scientist who's heavily funded by meat and dairy industry on the radio program. So then if you have the time, you put in a complaint to show that it's unbalanced reporting. They didn't declare he had this funding and so on. So you can do that if you have the time. So national broadcasters, they are obliged to do a balanced presentation. In Ireland now, like we heard in the US around climate change, they always had a climate scientist and a fossil fuel executive, which is nonsense. In Ireland, we still have a climate scientist and a farmer, or a farmer lobbyist, or a politician who's doing lobbying. So it's still biased in Ireland in terms of the conversation around food system change. But in the Irish scientific community, there's quite a bit of change now, and there's a lot of the scientists saying there has to be change.
Okay. Thank you for that. I've got a comment by Shabbat just saying Reformed talk to dairy farmers on how they can produce oat milk instead of dairy. Useful to know. Tina said, mentioned earlier that Ireland is in breach of pollution regulations. Is there a risk of building a reactionary response similar to the Dutch farmer protests?
That's a very good question. I do think they're, you know, in this transition, like, you know, of course we talk about a just transition, but not everybody, if we wanted to transition to a vegan food system, there are definitely stakeholders that are not going to benefit from such a transition. You know, like lots of people will be familiar with the story of the collapse of cod off Newfoundland. Now, when the Canadian government was about to announce restrictions on cod fishing in Newfoundland, even though the fish stocks had already collapsed, the fishers were attacking the police and kicking in the door of the politicians' meeting room as they were announcing those changes. So some groups are definitely going to be, you know, reactionary. Yeah. Now, at the same time, thankfully, we don't live in a dictatorship. We live in democracies. Of course, democracies with lots of lobbying, and if you've lots of money, you're more successful at lobbying. So there's going to have to be conversations, and speaking with farmers and fishers with respect, trying to understand where they're coming from, the intergenerational nature of the work that they've been doing. In the case of Ireland, you know, famine is a huge part of our history, and, you know, people's attachment to the land is very profound. But so you have to look at how you have to find ways that it's going to benefit all the stakeholders involved, if, you know, it's possible. There are things like the new proteins that are going to disrupt farmers. That's going to happen. You know, and vegan groups, we don't have much political power, or, but, as vegans make choices and become more aware and grow, companies are responding to all of those multiple choices that people are making.
Yeah.
But I think, in the Netherlands, the European Court of Justice ruled that their nitrates plan wasn't acceptable. So now all farmers, all dairy farmers, they're all being regulated. And what that does is it puts other sectors of the economy against the farming groups. And that's what's happening with climate change as well. Now farmers are protesting. They're very well organized to mobilize and protest really well. But there's going to be some changes there. But you see in the Netherlands now, those farmer groups now have politicians forming to support them and so on. So there will be some political difficulties there.
Thank you for that. Our last question, I'll go back to John. Let me just add you to the spotlight again.
Yes, hello there. You touched on the population, but you didn't really mention population increase, which is another sort of problematic term. I noticed you use fossil foods rather than animal foods because it annoys some people. But the smallest potential increase of the human population is from about 7 billion to 9 billion. So I'd have thought you could highlight the fact that given that we're going to have 2 billion more people on the planet, whether they're eating plant-based foods or animal-based foods, is going to have a huge impact on the climate in the coming years. But I just wonder why you didn't mention the size of the increasing size of the population.
Like the increasing population is a factor for lots of different reasons. Like if you're in a country and you're primarily dependent on biomass for fuel, then as the population is increasing, your trees are disappearing. So if you take a country like Ethiopia that has both huge grazing, huge biomass used for fuel, you have huge deforestation. So like obviously in the past, the population question was taken by environmentalists as being a main thing, when one of the main problems, of course, was the high consumption levels in rich countries. So when you look at food security, if you look at African countries, their per capita meat consumption is very, very low in countries like Nigeria or Gambia. Also, some of those cultures like Ethiopia, India, traditionally they had a lot of plant-based diets, predominantly plant-based diets. So I think I just focus more on Europe, and in Europe the population is, in lots of countries it's stagnant, it's growing a bit in Ireland. Now the farmed animal population is growing globally everywhere, and that's a big problem. And the number of wild-caught fish has peaked and is declining now, just because the ecosystems have been so heavily impacted. But it is still an impact, the growth of human population, because humans use a lot of resources. But for example, an Irish person compared to a Ugandan, we produce 80 times the greenhouse gas emissions of a Ugandan person. So the level of resource use by Europeans is so huge compared to many other, like the 9 planetary boundaries. There's a very nice image just, based on Kate Raworth's work that combines the planetary boundaries with, a donut economics, showing, we have to meet all our needs. So lots of people in lots of places in the world, have extreme needs, women subject to violence, obviously the crisis in Turkey-Syria border now. Those crises are, in my view, that crisis in Turkey is, nobody's talking about climate change in Turkey right now. It's not important. you know, it's survival they're talking about. So we mustn't forget as well that there's lots of areas where humans are suffering a lot, and you know that they're very addressing those needs and that suffering, and addressing poverty and inequality is also a huge issue.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
I'm going to say thank you ever so much, James, for coming and speaking to us and taking time out to do so. I said we'll be putting this on to YouTube for those to watch again, and I'll put the link for James's organization, the Vegan Sustainability Magazine, on there for those who want to have a look at that website and get more information. So if I could ask everybody to join me in thanking James with a round of applause. Okay.
Thanks everyone, and thanks Brian, and thanks Paul, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Keep well everyone. Keep